Yeah, so for everybody out there, my name is James Martin. I typically go by Jimmy. And just to give a little bit of background, I originally kind of decided that I was considering pharmacy actually when I was in high school, and then ended up going to University of Georgia for my undergraduate degree and got a bachelor's of science in biology and a minor in Spanish. So I took quite a few Spanish courses throughout my time in undergrad as well. And then I started the PharmD program here at CU in 2016. And really, throughout the time that I was at CU, a lot of people, will kind of try to figure out if there's a specialty you're interested in, et cetera. And I really had pretty broad interests. And it wasn't until my third year of pharmacy school when CU offers a core course in pharmacogenomics. And that's where I realized that that was really where I wanted to focus the rest of my career. So, with that being said, graduated from pharmacy school in 2020, which was kind of a difficult time to graduate. But I enrolled directly into a 3-year postdoctoral fellowship, again with CU under Dr. Aquilante, who's still here at the school and leads the course that I mentioned for the third years. And it was during that fellowship that really the basis was clinical pharmacogenomics, but the applications were quite broad. So I did a little bit of teaching, I did a little bit of clinical work where I saw patients, I did some broad education to providers at UC Health and elsewhere. And then I also did research. So my fellowship was technically considered a clinical research fellowship. So although it was research based, it was very clinical focused, if that makes sense. And that fellowship also included a master's program. So I did a master's of public health. If anybody has any interests or questions related to that, my concentration was epidemiology, which was pretty well aligned with my pharmacy education. And then, really, right before my 3 years of being a postdoc was up, I had the opportunity to initiate in a new position that was formed at CU, really in collaboration with the Colorado Center for Personalized Medicine. And I moved into that role in February of 2023, so about a year and a half ago. And now I'm currently still doing a lot of similar work that I started with my postdoc. And everything I do is pharmacogenomics based, but I'm more in a project management role now. So I work with UC Health and CU to get pharmacogenetic testing more easily available to our clinicians across the UC Health system and act as kind of a support and resource for clinicians who may have limited experience with pharmacogenomics. And if you guys don't know what pharmacogenomics is, what is pharmacogenomics is a perfectly acceptable first question. I'm happy to go over some of the basics there, or if you guys are interested in which areas of medicine are implicated by pharmacogenomics, whatever it may be, happy to talk about anything.
Yeah, that's my first question. What is genomics, and what is specifically during your studies was it like, I know that that's where I want to go?
Sure. So, just a very brief background pharmacogenomics essentially is the study of how genes, how your DNA help inform or predict your response to certain medications. So essentially, what we're doing is genetic testing for patients, and that can be done in a multitude of ways. But what we'll do is genetically test these patients, and then depending on what their DNA tells us, that can help inform either which medication we decide should be most appropriate to prescribe, or perhaps which specific dose is going to be most appropriate for the patient. So the example I like to use primarily is to do with metabolism. So that would just basically be your body's natural mechanism of breaking down medications. And a lot of pharmacogenetics kind of focuses on metabolism. So if you think about it as a spectrum, not everyone is going to metabolize a given drug in the exact same rate. They may do so more quickly or less quickly than the average person. And so having that information up front, basically by being able to do these types of genetic tests, allow us to hopefully dose or select medication that's going to be appropriate for the patient's genetics, and ideally before they're ever exposed to an inappropriate medication or dose. And sorry, you had a second part. When I really, I'll be quite honest, I didn't know too much about pharmacogenomics until my third year in pharmacy school. You hear about it a little bit in some of your other courses in the first 2 years, but it really wasn't until we started the program that I recognized that pharmacogenomics was at a place that it was already being applied clinically. So, you probably have heard about companies like 23andMe, et cetera. A lot of genetic testing has gotten real popular over the past decade or so. But really, it was in pharmacy school that I started learning about how we could be applying that information to benefit patients and their providers right now. So I think at first I thought it was a little bit more of like a, in a perfect world, this is what we do. And it wasn't until, like I said, third year of pharmacy school, recognized that we were able here at CU to be currently doing so. And to me, it was just pretty inevitably the future of medicine. Um, and without wanting to commit to a specific specialty such as oncology, psychiatry, et cetera, I really like pharmacogenomics because it really spans very broadly across nearly all areas of medicine. So even now, I still work with cardiology patients, I work with oncology patients, psychiatry patients, et cetera. So being able to use the pharmacogenomic skills that I learned in my postdoc to really apply to medicine more broadly.
This is personally very interesting to me, so I'll just keep asking questions if no one else does.
Please.
So, day in the life, what kind of stuff do you do compared to like a more traditional path of being a pharmacist?
Absolutely, yes. So my role is very unique. Even pharmacists that I meet when I describe it are usually quite surprised. So I guess compared to your traditional pharmacist, one, I don't have access to any medication, so I'm not filling meds or anything like that. My job is primarily remote, so I can work nearly 100% from home. I do go in to campus here and there for presentations or lectures, et cetera. But mainly, my day starts off at home. And, it really has changed a lot since I've been even in this role for only the past year and a half. So it's really dependent on clinical initiatives that we have going that are being funded by UC Health. So right now I'm working primarily with a group that has um, basically worked with the AMC, so the Anschutz Medical Campus, the gastroenterology clinic, and specifically in the oncology sector. So for patients that have, for example, pancreatic cancer or um, colorectal cancer, these patients are very likely to receive at least one of two chemotherapy agents that are very toxic, and that we do have very good data to use genetic testing to help guide dosing and medication selection. So basically, in day in the life, I wake up and I check on all of the patients that I have. So I help as project manager, I kind of help coordinate the PGX or pharmacogenomic orders that are being placed. And then I check every day to see which results have been returned. So, for example, if we had a patient come in last week for their initial visit, perhaps they had their sample collected, which is typically a blood draw, and maybe the result returns today, but their treatment starts tomorrow. I want to make sure that the oncologist who is dosing that medication is fully aware of the genetic results that have been returned. Because, like I mentioned, there can be a very severe reaction for a lot of these patients if they were to be given normal doses of medication. So, yeah, so it'll basically be looking for genetic abnormalities that are going to be associated with planned treatment, and then making sure that I inform the prescribers how to modify the dose, basically to keep the patient safe. So that would be one part of maybe my morning, and then attending meetings, usually via Zoom, similar to this, and working on expanding this current clinical service that we have alongside other ongoing research initiatives, basically to prove that what we're doing is beneficial for the patients at large. And that can kind of vary as research projects get completed and then new ones start up, et cetera.
Great, thanks so much. And I see that Whitney has a question about rotations. Did you do anything focused on this area?
For fourth year rotations, I'm assuming you're asking about.
Yep, yeah, sorry.
Um,
Mhm.
Yes, so I did not. And that was really so basically, in case you guys aren't fully aware, there's basically certain criteria that you have to meet throughout your fourth year. So you'll have a series of 6 week rotations that will be set. You have to have one inpatient, one ambulatory care, etc. You do have the chance to take two that are considered electives, which basically means you can select whatever you want within the scope of the school. And I did both of mine internationally. So I really did want to do a PGX rotation as one of my electives. And I actually tried to get it considered as an ambulatory care rotation, but it didn't quite have enough clinical day-to-day activities to be considered ambulatory care. So um, yeah, so I ended up doing a 6 week rotation in Guatemala and then one in New Zealand as my two electives. But my uh, particularly the pharmacogenomics rotation that was offered at CU at the time was very much so my next favorite choice.
Oh, I mean, if there's no questions on these international rotations, I don't know what will get questions. So, is that a common? I've heard more of people going in Central America to do the rotations, but I've not heard of New Zealand before. Did many of your classmates go international?
So I would say, at least compared to other programs in the country, CU has a very strong international opportunity for students. It's actually one of the things that I asked about. I've always loved travel, and as I mentioned, I learned Spanish when I was in undergrad, so that I could even travel more easily to Spanish-speaking countries, etc., and do volunteer work. But the um, yeah, I would say there was a handful of us from my class that did sign up for an international rotation. The one that I did in Guatemala was actually a little more well established. And Noah, you may know if it's something that's still being offered. I'm really not sure, but I did it with Dr. Schooler, who has since moved on, and Dr. Malhotra. Basically, it was a clinic on a banana plantation in the middle of a very rural area of Guatemala, not too far from the Pacific Ocean, quite far from any city. So yes, one of the I believe he works at Children's, but a physician there who was originally from that area of Guatemala recognized that there was a need for health services, and so basically the locals would have to travel over an hour, just to see a primary care physician, for example. So he established a clinic that lives there on the plantation 365 days a year. It's primarily staffed by Guatemalan physicians. And then basically from what I noticed, basically any medical graduate student on the Anschutz campus had the opportunity to visit there. And usually it would be for a week or two at a time. As I mentioned, my whole rotation was there. So I was there for 6 weeks. But at some points I was living with a med student. Another week we had an entire dental team come in, and they were just there for 1 week. And then there was another part of it where I was the only person who could speak English in the entire plantation. So very variable throughout that 6 weeks, but very enriching, very interesting, not only from a I guess experience standpoint as a student, but also the laws are going to be very different in countries like Guatemala than the regulatory laws that we have to worry about here in the United States. So although I was primarily working in the pharmacy, a lot of people would just come up and ask for certain medications without necessarily having a prescription, which is unique because here in the US, many of the medications that would be something that I gave out in Guatemala would require a prescription. But since they didn't require it there, we were able to basically use everything that we learned in pharmacy school and work with the local pharmacist to essentially prescribe medications as well. Not for everything by any means. We didn't have an operating room or anything like that. But for common ailments, et cetera, we were able to kind of help patients find what they needed.
Very interesting. And what about New Zealand?
Yeah, so very different. And I didn't do them quite back to back. I had one 6 week rotation in between, but they were pretty close. So in New Zealand, I worked in a more traditional community pharmacy, and again, they do have very different laws in New Zealand, but it's a little more similar to here in the U.S. So I guess my focus of that rotation was from more of like a global health perspective. So New Zealand is very much so has a nationalized healthcare system, and so the government has a lot of so I'm looking for a lot of interest in regulating things to help care for their citizens because they pay for all of the healthcare costs. So a couple of examples I like to give of things that I learned there. New Zealand is very far ahead in getting people to stop smoking because they realized, the negative health effects to the population and the potential costs that will cost the government. So they actually, I thought it was very interesting. There had a policy where each year a pack of cigarettes, for example, would go up by at least $1 New Zealand. So I think when I was there, my pharmacist told me it was like 30 New Zealand dollars, which would be maybe like 25 US dollars. And it was just going to continue going up until it's completely phased out. And I think they were going to do that by like 2030 or 2035. Um, but also, they are able to have very straightforward policies for payment for the entirety of the country. So that's something that I thought was very interesting too. You guys are likely very aware of how expensive medications can cost here in the US, and how perhaps you would need a prior authorization to get an insurance to cover a certain medication, even if the doctors, had already prescribed it and said it was the appropriate one, et cetera. So in New Zealand, they are able to bypass essentially all of that. And so their primary policy for all citizens was that you would pay $5 per prescription, no matter what it was, no matter how many tablets, no matter how long it was meant to last, et cetera. You would pay $5 per prescription until you hit $100 within a year, and then the government would take care of everything else. I'm not 100% sure if that's still the nationwide policy, but in 2019, when I was there, that's how it was. So the most that anybody would ever have to pay for their meds would be $100 within a given year. So I kind of focused some of my rotation on comparing the health system in New Zealand to what we have here in the US.
Great. Sure. That would be nice. Okay, so Larson has some questions about
Mhm.
what you're doing with genetic tests, and so what kind of test do you run, and what information do you get from that?
Yeah, so happy to go into this a little bit more in depth. So we do basically kind of depending on your setting of where you would be doing pharmacogenetic testing, you would have any number of what we call pharmacogenes that you would want to test for. And for each of these genes, there is an organization that publishes a specific number of variants that must be included when you're testing to make sure that you are categorizing the patients correctly. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I spoke briefly earlier about metabolism. So that's a big thing in pharmacogenomics. So really just looking at how a patient may break down a certain medication. So for that, we would look at certain genes such as CYP2C19, CYP2D6, CYP2C9 as three of the most common. And essentially the information that we can gather from the genetic results is going to be also specific to the medication. So if it is a medication that is active as in its oral form as whenever you take it, if you have a decreased metabolism, you're going to be more likely to have that medication build up within your system. And the clinical recommendations are typically going to be to either avoid that medication or to take a lower dose. On the flip side, if you have an ultra rapid metabolizer status, for example, so basically your body is able to break down medications more quickly than usual, then perhaps you would need a higher dose or a different medication so that you could be able to have your body reach that therapeutic effect that was intended by the medication. That's just kind of an example for metabolizing enzymes, but we also do tests for things such as transporter proteins. So if you think about it, certain medications that you take will be dissolved usually, within your GI tract, and then it'll go into your blood where it'll essentially then be able to travel to whichever part of your body that it needs to be working in. So if you think about something like statin medication, which is primarily used for high cholesterol. It's very, very common, particularly here in the US. Most folks are on statins at some point in their life. Um, the cholesterol production is actually done within your liver. So your body has these certain proteins that will be able to bring the drug from your blood into the liver. So we do genetic tests for the gene that encodes for that protein. And if that is lower than average, then basically when you take the same amount of medication as somebody else, you may have higher levels of the medication in your blood that's not able to get into your liver. So that helps us inform which specific statin medications the patient should be on and at which dose. Um, we also do things that are associated with hypersensitivity reactions. So if you guys have ever heard of HLA, it's a family of genes which can help predict often fatal adverse reactions, even with a slight exposure to a certain medication. So for those genetic tests, if we ever have a positive variant determined from the genetic test, then we actually consider that medication contraindicated and recognize that the patient should never be exposed to it, even in a small dose, because those types of hypersensitivity reaction, similar to an allergic reaction, but there are certain differences. Anyway, could be fatal. So we do those kind of testing. We also do multi-gene considerations. So for some of our medications, for example, warfarin or Coumadin, it's a relatively old medication, but it's very often prescribed if a patient had to get a cardiac stent placed after a heart attack, for example. Then the way to dose warfarin is very difficult. It has what we would call in pharmacy a very low therapeutic index, meaning you have to get the dose very correct, because overdosing or underdosing the patient can be very dangerous. So for that, we actually have been able to develop an algorithm within our system that uses 4 different genetic results alongside 6 or 7 different clinical considerations, and basically use all of that information to then spit out a recommended dose. So there are, those are just a couple of examples of different applications, but just to give you an idea of what we have going on at UC Health right now, we basically have a UC Health wide initiative to return genetic results. And when we do so, we return the genetic results into the electronic health record. So the computerized system where physicians will be entering medication orders. And we build clinical decision support to help. Basically, if a provider is prescribing a medication that interacts with the patient's genetics, we build a pop-up that'll show and tell the provider exactly what they need to do specific to that patient. And as of right now, we have tools live for 53 different medications in across UC Health system. And yeah, that will cover 12 different genes. So there are a lot of different types of genetic results that we return. But basically, the short answer to your question is we do all types of genetic testing with the intention that the results are going to be helpful for selecting or dosing certain medications.
Hey there, Dr. Martin. I had a quick question. This is Alexander. Is it appropriate if I ask it at this point in time? I don't want to interrupt.
Please, go ahead.
So again, my name is Alexander, and you've been covering a lot of really, I'm extremely interested in pharmacogenomics, so this is really great to just kind of hear the broad, overview. But I kind of wanted to ask a question more specifically related to, research and drug development and kind of how pharmacogenomics is going to play a role in, I guess, the actual procedure of research. So at UC specifically, does it seem like pharmacogenomics is going to be something that broadly we want everyone in the field of research to be able to do, or does it seem something more focused to a specialist where you kind of collaborate with someone and there's kind of a lot of communication between, I guess, specialists, so to speak?
Yeah, great question. And as you may have noticed, I mentioned that I did quite a bit of research in my postdoc, but my focus now is more of clinical implementation. So I tend to speak more about that. But you're exactly right. Research is still very ongoing and of interest. Here at CU, we do have quite a few resources that clinicians that are not specifically trained in pharmacogenomics can still do research that's associated with pharmacogenomics. So, for example, if we had a researcher that had the data for 1,000 patients, and each of these patients, developed a certain disease by age 14, and it was not understood why, but that was something that the investigator noticed. What we could do, and what a lot of researchers on campus do, is what's called a genome-wide association study, and can look for specific variants that may apply to multiple of the cases. So I'm not going to go into the research side too much in depth, but CU actually has really great set of resources that include, the application of real human trials, but also these types of in silico is what you would call it, kind of computer simulation type things, where you can basically run tests on real patients' genetic data to see if there's any correlation. So I mentioned a little bit about how we're able to apply pharmacogenetics at this point, and although we do have many applications, there's still a lot that we are learning. If you think about genetics as a study, it really wasn't until 2003 that the Human Genome Project was completed, and that allowed basically researchers to access the entire genome of a human. So that was just about 20 years ago. So there's still a lot of research going on, and it is very much so encouraged for clinicians, researchers, investigators that are not necessarily trained in pharmacogenomics to still keep the genetics in mind, because we learn new things every day, whether that's disease risk genetic testing, pharmacogenomics that help with drug response, like I mentioned, or others. And if you had another part that I didn't answer, feel free to remind me.
Oh, no, 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 you did. That's really excellent. Thank you so much. I think, yeah, no, you broadly covered my question. Yeah, thank you again.
Yeah, and I will just mention, although I'm primarily on the clinical implementation side, we kind of think of really all drug development type initiatives to be a spectrum. So you have clinical trials, et cetera, and that can go all the way until drug approval, and then basically getting it into a formulation that's able to be given to a patient, and then actually administering the data. So pharmacogenomics really plays a role along that entire spectrum. So you'll see even more and more now than 5 years ago, even new FDA drugs that are being approved by the FDA will have a specific pharmacogenetics criteria that they need to meet or do. Sometimes it's post hoc for patients, so they'll run the whole trial and then look back at the patient's genetic data to see if they can make any correlations. But pharmacogenomics itself is very much so present all the way from the bench, which would be the wet lab research, to the bedside, which would be more what I do with clinical implementation. So, okay, we have these genetic results for a patient. We know that the patient's genes aren't going to change throughout their lifetime. How do we think of ways to get this information to apply to the rest of the patient's life without them necessarily needing to memorize or have a specialty in pharmacogenomics, or really even be able to pronounce pharmacogenomics, which most of our patients cannot. So I'm a little more on the implementation side, and I'm happy to talk more about that. That goes along with the clinical decision support that I spoke a little bit about earlier.
It's actually extremely fascinating. Sorry to jump in again. But yeah, speaking with the
Please.
clinical decision making, I know, I guess from my understanding, I just kind of learned about this during my interview process with CU, but like collaborative care agreements, how does that, what is the status of that broadly? I know it seems to be unique to Colorado. How is that being implemented in the curricular, and how do you see that evolving over the next decade?
Sure. So that is something that is a very rapidly developing part of pharmacy as of right now. So just in case that's a new term for the group, collaborative care practices typically will allow, so for example, an oncology pharmacist, as a pharmacist, they don't necessarily have prescriptive authority in most settings, but MDs do. So basically what a collaborative practice agreement is that the pharmacist is able to have certain prescriptive abilities or other parts of their job that they can do that they wouldn't necessarily be able to do just based on their license if they work under kind of a larger organization, and typically in partnership with a prescribing physician. So all of that being said, it's by no means unique to Colorado, but I'm very proud to say Colorado is kind of a leader in that field. So I grew up in Georgia. went to undergrad there, and I moved to Colorado directly for pharmacy school. And it was actually very interesting as we were going through, we were learning about something similar to collaborative practice agreements, but really prescriptive authority that was being given to pharmacists or PharmDs within the state. So I could already tell them that PharmDs in Colorado, compared to Georgia, for example, at least at that time, were able to prescribe quite a few additional medications than would be legally allowed in Georgia. Now, when it comes to pharmacogenomics, this field has really been pioneered by pharmacists alongside PhD researchers and MDs. But really, pharmacists are somewhat at the forefront of pharmacogenomics and their clinical applicability. So, it's not something that we have to do as pharmacist clinicians. If we are working with PGX, as long as we're not prescribing the medication, we don't require any kind of collaborative practice agreement. It's totally within the rights of our degree and our license within the state of Colorado to provide recommendations based on genetic tests. And then, doing something like a postdoc that I did allows you to, I guess, be certified to take those results and apply them clinically. So, sorry, long-winded answer, but basically we don't necessarily have to work with any kind of collaboration, but we also are not prescribing the medication. So as of right now, it's a primarily pharmacist-led initiative, and we work directly with the physicians to help them make the decisions for their patients. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, it's the MD, PA, or MP that's typically placing the order. And that really works quite well because, pharmacogenomics is quite insightful. It can be very informative for a lot of medications, but there are other pieces to the puzzle, as we call it. And so for my job, for example, when I'm seeing patients, it's not an entire PCP visit where you would run all the tests, et cetera. Usually I have access to some of the clinical data, but that's not really part of applying pharmacogenomics. It's really how do the genetics play into this patient, and then leaving it up to the prescribers to take that into consideration alongside clinical considerations and then make a final decision. All that being said, there are a few circumstances where we will be very much have basically a good reason to be very firm about our pharmacogenomics-based recommendation. So a case that I think is a really good example of this is clopidogrel, it goes by the trade name Plavix. It's somewhat similar to warfarin that I spoke about earlier. So clopidogrel is a very common drug, relatively cheap. It's prescribed to a lot of patients after they have cardiac stent placement or perhaps after they have a stroke. And for patients with a certain CYP2C19 phenotype, so a phenotype would be essentially the way that the genetic results are interpreted. So for certain patients, there's an FDA black box warning against prescribing clopidogrel to certain patients based on their genetic results. So for that case, when we were building our clinical decision support tools, we actually started speaking with the head of cardiology and cardiologists in general, and they wanted us to build an alert within the system that would actually take off an order of clopidogrel if it had an interaction with the patient's genetics and place another drug from the same class that does not have that interaction. So really depending on the specific drug gene interaction or the severity of the potential outcome, we are able to, I guess, make firm or soft recommendations, if that makes sense.
No, it does. That's extremely awesome. Thank you so much.
And in the chat, Whitney had a question. What type of providers do you work with regularly in your role? And do you mainly work with physicians or do you work with genetic counselors?
Great questions. So we work with all types of providers. So I guess if I just focus initially on my team, even my team is made up of all different types of providers and professionals from kind of different backgrounds. We do work directly with genetic counselors, but I really think of this type of genetic testing as two major categories. One being disease risk, which would be primarily what the genetic counselors work with, and then pharmacogenomics, which is primarily what pharmacists, at least within our organization, typically focus on. So, but even within our small group, we work with multiple MDs. Sometimes we'll have physician's assistants or nurse practitioners that come on calls. We will have genetic counselors. And then, just kind of taking an additional step back, we also work within a health system. So we do have marketing professionals, et cetera. When it comes to kind of clinically who we speak to the most, it really depends on which phase of our project that we're working on. So I'll give you a couple of examples. I mentioned earlier that we have started a clinical initiative to make pharmacogenetic testing more easily available and the interpretation of the results more heavily resourced for oncology patients. So as we were prepping for initiating that clinical pilot, we were speaking to both oncologists and oncology PharmDs quite frequently. Now, and we still continue to do so, primarily because as these results continue to return, we want to make sure that the oncologists feel supported. Now, when it comes to our broad genetic testing that we do, that's where I mentioned that we have 53 different medications within the system that have clinical decision support already built. We talk to all kinds of folks. So basically, I help manage a team. It goes by the name PIPSI, which is kind of a funny one, but it's a pre-implementation pharmacogenomic stakeholder engagement and education group. And basically, when we decide that we want to start the conversation for how we're going to build a new tool within the system, we want to make sure that we are talking to the providers who prescribe the medication of interest the most. And so really who we talk to depends on which drug or gene that we are planning on pushing into development. Now, something that's relatively interesting is that a single gene may be associated with multiple medications that could be across broad categories of medicine. So a good example of this would be CYP2D6. This is an enzyme that basically breaks down about a quarter of all meds that are on the current US market right now. So a very relatively ubiquitous enzyme, but it will apply to medications that are associated with psychiatry. It can apply to oncology, specifically supportive care. It applies in cardiology. So when we were planning on going live with CYP2D6, we had to make a list of all the drugs that were associated with CYP2D6 that we were interested in building decision support tools for. And then we went and talked to the primary providers or prescribers of those medications, usually starting with the department head and then moving down. So, for the past, it'll be basically any type of provider that you can imagine. We have probably talked to them in some form or fashion. And that includes outpatient, that includes inpatient. We have transplant medication. So that includes, very specific surgical partners, et cetera, that we end up talking to. Anesthesiologists. I mean, it's really across the board. Was there a second part of that question that I missed?
No, I think
Oh,
they're related, so I think you covered it. So
okay.
I think you're good. And we are up at the end of the time that we have for this. So thank you, everyone who attended. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for your just listening. So we really appreciate that. If you have, we'll send a follow-up email either tomorrow or next week. I'm not sure when we'll get to that. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or Dr. Martin. There'll be more information in that email about like who to reach out to if you do have questions. So thank you again for attending, and make sure you fill out that link to request your application fee waiver if you still need that. So have a good day, and thanks for attending.